Welcome back to the deep dive. We've talked about the during of psychedelics a lot, like what happens when you're actually tripping. But today we're diving into the aftermath, the long-term effects, especially on the brain. Like, do these things really rewire you?
Yeah, it's a big question a lot of folks have. And it's not just like, are you going to be weirder forever, right? It gets down to the molecules, how your neurons connect, the whole deal. And you've given me a ton to go through on this, which is great research articles, medical brochures. There's even a lecture from Stanford in here.
No, I love to keep you busy. But honestly, that's what makes this so cool.
Mm,
We're not just speculating, we're looking at the actual science.
exactly. And a lot of it centers around this concept called receptor-mediated neuroplasticity.
Say that 5 times fast.
Right. It's a mouthful. But basically, it means how psychedelics can change the physical structure and function of your brain even long after the experience is over.
So like brain remodeling thanks to shrooms.
Kind of. I mean, it's not that simple, but you're getting the idea. And to understand this, we got to talk about set and setting. Remember that old saying?
Oh yeah, like your mindset and environment during the trip. I thought that was more about like having a good time, not freaking out.
Well, it turns out it's more than that. There's research, a 2024 study actually, by Borkel and some other folks, showing that your mindset going into a psychedelic experience and the environment you're in can really impact the long-term psychological effects.
Like for years after.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Yep. They found people who were really focused on personal growth, who did these experiences in natural settings with people they trust. They tended to have fewer negative outcomes later on, more well-being. It's like setting an intention for how you want your brain to change.
Whoa, so it's not just tripping out, it's almost like therapy.
That's a great point, and this is really important for the whole conversation about using psychedelics to help people heal. Creating the right set and setting isn't just like a fun bonus. It's crucial to getting lasting benefits.
Okay, I'm officially intrigued. So break this neuroplasticity thing down for me. Like, first, explain it like I'm 5 years old, then hit me with the college lecture version.
All right, so imagine your brain is a huge forest, right? The neurons are all the trees, and the connections between them are like pathways.
Got it. Love a good metaphor.
So psychedelics, they can come in and act like a growth spurt for the forest, even changing which way the paths go. And one way they do this is by affecting a protein called BDNF, which is like brain fertilizer. It helps those neuron trees grow and connect.
So, more BDNF, more connections, more brain power. Does that mean everyone should be microdosing?
Hold on, not so fast. There's this other side to the coin we got to talk about, receptor desensitization.
Oh, that sounds complicated.
It is, but it's important. Basically, if you keep flooding your brain with any substance, those little signal receivers, the receptors, they can get less sensitive over time. Like, think about drinking coffee. That first cup is amazing, right? But by cup 5, you barely even taste it. Same kind of thing can happen in the brain.
So, too much of a good thing, even if it's brain boosting, can backfire.
Exactly. It's about balance. And that's why responsible use is so important with psychedelics. We got to understand how they work, both the good and the potentially not so good.
Okay, this is where my brain starts to hurt a little, but in a good way.
Mm.
We're talking about tiny molecules changing how I think long term. Wild. That Stanford lecture really dug into this, especially with the serotonin receptors.
It is wild, and yeah, that lecture was great. Serotonin is a key player here. Like take MDMA, for example, ecstasy. It mainly works on those serotonin receptors. Really promising for therapy, but there's also concern about what it could do to the heart over time, specifically something called valvulopathies.
Valvu what now? Is that bad?
It means problems with your heart valves. Some research suggests MDMA, because of how it hits those serotonin receptors, specifically the 5-HT2B subtype, it can cause heart valves to thicken. So that's something doctors are watching closely, especially with more and more people using MDMA in therapy.
Okay, so it's not all sunshine and brain rainbows with these things. Got it. Potential downsides too. But how does LSD fit into all this long-term brain change stuff? It's pretty different from MDMA, right?
Very different. LSD is known for its super long-lasting effects. One dose can last 8 to 12 hours, sometimes even longer. And there are cases of people experiencing flashbacks or something called HPPD, which stands for...
HPTD. Okay, that definitely doesn't sound good.
It stands for hallucinogen persisting perception disorder. It's rare, but some people who've used LSD, they start seeing visual disturbances like trails or halos around objects, even when they're not tripping.
So like permanent visual glitches. Yikes.
We don't fully get why it happens, but it seems more common with repeated or high-dose LSD use.
Uh,
It's a reminder that even with the potential benefits, we got to be aware of the potential risks.
Noted. Maybe not a daily LSD habit then. What about ayahuasca? Totally different beats, right? Literally.
Oh yeah, completely different. Ayahuasca is this brew combining DMT, which is a super potent psychedelic, with plants that have MAOIs in them.
MAOIs.
Yeah.
Those.
Monoamine oxidase inhibitors. They basically stop the DMT from being broken down in the body, so you can actually feel the effects when you drink it. It's a pretty carefully balanced combo.
Like ancient jungle chemistry. But
Yeah.
seriously, what about the long-term stuff with ayahuasca? It's got this whole spiritual reputation.
Yeah, it's been used traditionally for a long time, and studies are now starting to show that it can have positive effects on well-being, maybe even spirituality and creativity long term.
So there could be some science behind the whole plant medicine thing.
It seems so. But those MAOIs I mentioned, they can interact really badly with some medications and foods. That's why it's super important to work with experienced folks who know the right dosages and understand those risks.
So it's not just about the brew, it's about the brewer too. Man, this whole deep dive is making one thing crystal clear. Responsible use is key, no matter what psychedelic we're talking about.
Couldn't agree more. These things have huge potential, but they demand respect and understanding. Knowing the science, the possible benefits, and the risks. That's how we make good choices. It's really exciting, right? We're finally starting to figure out how this stuff works on a deeper level, not just the woo-woo aspects.
Right. Speaking of woo-woo, though, you mentioned ayahuasca and spirituality earlier. Is there actually any science to that? Or is it just, like, vibes?
That's a great question, and one that a lot of researchers are trying to answer. Brain imaging studies show that psychedelics can actually activate areas of the brain that are linked to those kinds of experiences, religious, spiritual, transcendent. So there might be a biological basis for that feeling of connectedness.
Wow, so maybe those monks meditating on mountaintops were onto something after all.
Yeah.
But back to the practical stuff. You mentioned the MAPS brochure on MDMA therapy. Anything jump out at you from that?
Yeah, it was really interesting how much detail they went into about the monitoring they do during those sessions. Like, they track heart rate, blood pressure, even body temperature super carefully because MDMA can affect all that.
So it's not just like popping a pill and talking about your feelings.
Not even close. They've got really strict guidelines for dosage, the setting where those sessions happen, and even the psychological support you get before, during, and after the experience. It's a very controlled process.
Makes sense with all this stuff we've been talking about with the heart and those receptors. But what about the long-term effects on, like, your personality, your emotions? Can psychedelics actually change who you are as a person?
There's a growing body of evidence that suggests they can, yeah, especially when it comes to something called openness to experience. It seems like those changes in neuroplasticity we talked about earlier, they can help people kind of break free from rigid thinking patterns, become more open to new ideas and perspectives.
So, like, psychedelics could make you more adaptable, more open-minded.
Potentially, yeah. And that has some pretty big implications, not just for treating things like depression or anxiety, but maybe even for like personal growth and how we interact with each other.
Okay, now you're getting me all philosophical. But
Yeah.
let's be real, there's got to be some downsides too. Are there any long-term risks to messing with your brain like this?
Definitely. Some people can have really challenging experiences during a psychedelic trip, anxiety, paranoia, even flashbacks, and it's really important to have support afterwards to process all that safely.
And I imagine if you already have some kind of mental health condition, that could complicate things even more.
Oh, for sure. People with a history of psychosis, for example, they might be more susceptible to those negative psychological effects. That's why careful screening and evaluation before any kind of psychedelic therapy is absolutely crucial.
Right, it's not just a magic bullet for everyone. You mentioned LSD before, but that Stanford lecture also talked about something called the default mode network. What is that exactly, and how do psychedelics play into it?
So think of the default mode network as your brain's autopilot. It's that network that's active when you're kind of daydreaming, lost in thought, not really focused on a specific task. And psychedelics seem to disrupt this network, quiet it down.
So less mind-wandering, more present moment awareness. Is that a good thing? I mean, sometimes I like to get lost in my thoughts.
It can be beneficial in certain ways. Like, that disruption of the default mode network is thought to be part of why people describe feeling ego dissolution or transcendence on psychedelics. It's like you're loosening the grip of your usual sense of self and experiencing a sense of interconnectedness with everything.
Okay, so it's like hitting the reset button on your brain's default settings.
Yeah.
And that ties back into the neuroplasticity idea, right? If you can shake up those ingrained thought patterns, it opens up space for new connections to form.
Exactly. And that's where a lot of the therapeutic potential comes in. By disrupting those negative thought loops that contribute to things like depression or addiction, psychedelics might create an opportunity for new, healthier ways of thinking and feeling to take hold.
So it's not just about the trip itself, it's about the lasting changes those substances can trigger in your brain, like updating your mental software.
But are we really just scratching the surface here? Is there more to this whole psychedelic thing than we even realize yet?
I think we are just scratching the surface. We're learning more all the time, but the research is still pretty young. And it's not just about treating illnesses, it's about like what's possible for personal growth, creativity, even how we connect with each other as humans. It's a really fascinating field with so much potential.
Okay, now you're getting me excited. But before we get carried away on a wave of cosmic consciousness, let's bring it back down to earth a bit. What would you say is the biggest takeaway from all this for someone who's just trying to wrap their head around this whole world of psychedelics?
I think the most important thing is to approach it all with both curiosity and a healthy dose of respect. These are powerful substances, and they have the potential for both healing and harm. It's about finding that balance. Knowledge is power, right? The more we understand about how these things work, the better choices we can make. But speaking of choices, I'm curious about your thoughts on the ethics of all this. As psychedelics become more mainstream, how do we make sure they're used responsibly?
That's a huge question, and it's one we need to be having more open conversations about. We need to be talking honestly about the risks and the benefits and figure out clear guidelines for therapy, harm reduction, education, all of that.
And we can't forget about the cultural context either. Psychedelics have a really long history of spiritual use in many cultures. We need to be approaching those traditions with respect and sensitivity as we move forward.
Absolutely. There's a lot we can learn from those communities about how to use these substances in a way that's meaningful and safe. It's about finding that balance between scientific exploration and honoring those long-standing traditions.
That's also about personal responsibility, right?
Mm.
It's not just about the substance itself. It's about the choices we make and the intentions we bring to the experience.
I totally agree. Education and self-awareness are so crucial. People need to really understand the potential risks, the importance of set and setting, and the need for integration and support. It's not something to take lightly.
Like a dance, you know? Science and spirituality, individual choice, and collective responsibility. It's all intertwined.
Beautifully put. And that's what I think makes this whole conversation so fascinating. We're not just exploring the science of psychedelics, but how they impact our consciousness, our understanding of the world, even how we connect with each other. It's a really exciting time to be paying attention to this field.
Yeah, it's really like we're shifting from demon drugs to like, wait, these things could help us. It's a big deal.
It is. It really is. And I think that shift is happening because the research is getting better, people are sharing their stories, and there's this growing awareness that, hey, these substances have been used safely and in meaningful ways for a long time in a lot of different cultures.
Okay, so if someone's listening to this and they're like, whoa, sign me up. Where do I learn more? What would you tell them?
First thing, do your research and make sure it's from good sources, right? There's a lot of misinformation floating around, so stick to scientific journals, organizations like MAPS, credible experts in the field.
Yeah, don't just believe everything you read on Reddit.
Exactly. And be aware of the laws where you live, because they can be very different from place to place.
True, true. Psychedelic laws are a whole other deep dive.
For sure. And if someone is actually considering psychedelic therapy, finding a qualified and experienced practitioner is absolutely crucial. This isn't something to mess around with on your own.
Couldn't agree more. Safety first, always. But beyond all the practical stuff, I think it's important to remember that intention and respect matter a lot too, right? It's not just about having some crazy experience. It's about engaging with these substances in a way that feels meaningful and could even be transformative.
Yeah, absolutely. That intention piece is so important. And also remembering that integration is key. What you do after the experience matters just as much as what happens during it. Having support systems in place, whether that's therapy or journaling or connecting with other people who get it, can make a huge difference in processing what you've learned.
It's kind of like anything that really shakes up your worldview. It takes time to integrate those insights and actually apply them to your life, you know?
Yeah, definitely. And those insights can be pretty profound sometimes. Psychedelics have a way of, like, loosening things up in your mind, showing you patterns you might not have seen before, offering completely new perspectives.
So it's not just about changing the brain. It's about changing how we see the world, how we understand ourselves, all of that.
Exactly. And that's one of the things that makes this whole field so exciting to me. We're not just talking about treating symptoms, we're talking about like expanding consciousness, exploring what it really means to be human.
Okay, so we've covered a lot today, from the science of how these things change your brain to the potential for healing and personal growth, and even touched on the whole spirituality thing. If we take a step back, what do you think it all means? What's the big takeaway?
Well, I think we're seeing the beginning of a future where psychedelics aren't seen as these scary, taboo things anymore. I think we're starting to understand that they can be powerful tools for healing, for understanding ourselves better, for personal transformation, and for creating a better world, honestly.
Yeah, that's a future I'm definitely here for. And I have a feeling our listeners are too. But we've only just scratched the surface here. There's so much more to explore.
So much more. We encourage you to keep learning, keep asking questions. All the sources we've talked about today, those are all linked in the show notes so you can dive in deeper.
And until next time, keep those minds open and those brains buzzing.